Hello, history scholars. Today's lecture is going to focus on the French and Indian War as well as the Proclamation of 1763. Essential understandings that I would really like you to have at the end of this lecture and end of the lesson is number one, why was the war fought? And number two, what was the impact to colonial America? All right, a little bit about the war itself first. First of all, the French and Indian War has many names. Um, it is also known as the 7 Years' War. It has a bunch of different names. And the reason is because it was fought really all over the world. The French and Indian War is what we typically call the war based in colonial America. But really, this war extended over many years, not just seven, many years all over the world. And so, according to this map, you can see that, the Spanish Empire is in red, Portuguese Empire in that kind of yellowy color, British Empire is green, Russian Empire is lighter green, which I think is kind of confusing, but that's cool. Dutch Empire is brown, Ottoman Empire is light brown, French Empire, I don't know, it looks the same color to me. And then the areas of conflict are those stripes. And so you can see over about a 21 to 23-year period, there were battles all over the world. And most of the battles did take place in Europe, India, and colonial America, and a little bit in Northern Africa. So that's really important to know. Another thing is you may see, and in fact, one of the maps that I'm going to show you a little bit later in this lecture says the French and Indian War spanned from 1754 to 1763. And the reason is because England was fighting at that time, but they didn't actually declare war until 1756. And so, anyway, that's why you have just a variety of names, a variety of dates. This really is typically known as the First World War, not to be confused with World War One, but a lot of people refer to this as really the first international conflict or war. So something to keep in mind. So, focusing on the battles or the area that was battled over during this war in North America. So, this is a map of 1700. Again, the British lands, the 13 original colonies, are off to the right hand side in red. The French lands are green. The Spanish lands are in that yellow color, and then disputed or unclaimed land is that peachy color. So, what's very, very important to understand, you guys, right now, is that this, if you can see my cursor, these are the 13 original colonies. We then have this unoccupied region here, and really this is known as the Ohio River Valley. And then you have France over here, and Britain and France both want this area. They're fighting over it like a tug of war. And the reason is because the Ohio River Valley has some really amazing goods. It's a fertile valley. The colonists want it. They're moving out there anyway. They're pushing west. And the French, even though the French are not really settling in those areas, they like it because they like the furs. They really want to control the fur trade. And so they set up a whole bunch of forts in absence of settlers, really. But they really want that area as well. And so we have two things going on here. We have a fight over this land because of trade, and we have the fight over the land for settlement. All right, this is the map that I kind of referred to, that this map actually, when we call this war the 7 Years' War, that's where it gets confusing because I don't know, I'm not a math person myself, but you do the math and this doesn't add up to seven. But regardless, interchangeably, you may hear me refer to this war as the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. It's not called the 9 Years' War. Okay, just FYI. So, not to make things confusing, but now we have new colors. The British possession is 1754 in purple. And then we have the French possession in 1754, which is in yellow. We have troop movement, that red arrow. the red arrows. And then we have the British and French forts that have, they kind of look like little castles. So take a look at that. You can pause me or whatever. But really, you see that these French forts are set up really strategically along the lakes and along the rivers and things like that because they are there for fur. And fur is going for a hot dollar over in Europe. And so if they can get um, enough fur in order to sell the raw good to Europe, they're going to make a pretty penny, right? And so it really is important to France in order to gain the territory. England just wants land. They also see the benefit of furs. But anyway, this is what's going on now. During this war, we have a lot of benefit. The British had a lot of benefits. The reason that they ended up winning the war largely was because they had a militia. They had a colonial militia that was willing to fight on behalf of England because we still were, a part of England at the time. And the French really didn't have that same manpower. Also, at this point in time, I think it's a pretty good time to talk about the different tribes that were fighting on each side. Now, if you kind of think about France, you don't have a lot of settlers in France. You don't have the people that are taking Native American land from the Native Americans, who this territory has been theirs their entire lives. You also have French missionaries that are in the area, and a lot of the traders as well, the trappers, and a lot of them have learned the languages of the Native American tribes. And so they have a fairly well established communication with these tribes. And so you have some tribes reaching out to the French and taking their side. And those tribes are the Ottawa, the Algonquin, the Shawnee, for example. And then you have some groups, some Native American tribes that do choose to fight with the British. And largely, you can't ignore the fact that a lot of these tribes fought against each other for hundreds, if not thousands, of years before white settlement. And so, some of these tribes would choose the opposite side just so that they could fight against their, I don't know, the other tribes that they've always battled with. So the tribes that chose to fight with the Britons were the Iroquois and the Cherokee, for example. So just a little bit of info for you. All right, you guys. On the left-hand side, pre-war boundaries of 1754, you see this is kind of a little bit of the same information I've given you before, but here we are. This is the disputed land that's really rich in soil and in furs, and that's what we're fighting over. Down here, Florida's still hanging out as a Spanish territory. We haven't gotten that yet, but it'll be soon when we are able to have it. Here's post-war boundaries of 1763. You see that Britain wins. The French just weren't able to, pull their own or whatever, and so they end up losing. Um, as a part of the treaty that was established in 1763, you can see this line. And we'll get to that a little bit more, but that is known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 was decided as a part of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. So after this war is over, we have a whole bunch of people that gather in Paris and they talk about how can we work out the details of the British victory. And so we'll get to that in a second, but one of them was to establish this boundary. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, I think I've already gone over all of this stuff. Yeah, we already understand the Ohio River Valley is important. Both countries claimed areas. Yep. Both countries built forts. Yeah. All right. I've covered all that. If you want to go back, you can always back me up and pause. Okay. All right. A little bit about the main forts that were fought. So we have an interesting story where young George Washington, was a leader during this war. And he and his troop were traveling and they were at Fort Necessity. And it is believed that George Washington fired on an unarmed group of people, which started the war. And anyways, so that's just a little bit of tidbit for you. But Fort Duquesne, Fort Necessity, Fort Louisville, and then there were a couple others that were really important as well. Ticonderoga were sites of these battles. Okay, the Treaty of Paris of 1763. All right, this is what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. This is where they had to figure out all of the details post war, and this really impacted the British colonists. So you have British colonists, they are all here, they're all lined up in the 13 original colonies, and they want to push west. They want to push toward the Great Lakes, they want to take over the Ohio River Valley, and they really also like the trapping as well. And all of a sudden, you have Britain saying, it's probably not so good of an idea to move into the Ohio River Valley because a lot of Native American tribes are really unhappy with that, and so they drew this imaginary line, and the imaginary line was to stop the colonists from moving into the Ohio River Valley. So there's a little bit of irony here in that you have the Brits and the colonists that fought really valiantly or whatever to have control over this region. And then all of a sudden, after the war, the British government is like, nah, just kidding. You can't move. And this largely came up because of Pontiac's rebellion. So Pontiac was a leader of one of the Native American tribes, very upset. And as the British colonists were moving west, he attacked, and it was a disaster. And so this is why the British government said, we need to really kind of rethink. We have to rethink how quickly we move toward the Appalachian Mountains. And so we're going to just draw this line through the Appalachian Mountains, and you British colonists just need to stay put. And so the irony of the British colonists saying, we fought really hard for this, we've gone through a whole lot, and now we can't, it angered them. All right. And so you have a whole bunch of colonists that are just like, we're moving anyway. We're moving anyway into this land, and we're going to settle. Even though there were um, royal armies that were there to send people back over the Appalachian Mountains. But the colonists were basically like not having it. All right. So the Proclamation line of 1763 kind of caused some major problems. All right. And by the way, this is where we gain Florida from Spain as well. So this part then becomes British territory. And yeah, so we got that from the Spanish in the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so moving right along. Okay, so we have some effects of the war on American colonials. So, number one, there is an increased sense of unity among the colonists. You have, up until this point, and you probably remember from my lecture last week, is that you have colonists up and down the Atlantic coast that have these different purposes. They have a different lifestyle. Some of these colonies are more religiously tolerant than others. Some of them are much more agricultural. And so we almost have a feeling of states' rights even before states' rights existed. And so the war of the French and Indian War really brought unity to these 13 colonies, just like a sense of a same type of goal. It brought them together. And in fact, this is a piece of propaganda created by Benjamin Franklin. And if you look really carefully at this snake, and I believe he carved it out of wood, you have the abbreviations for all of the 13 original colonies. And up to this time, all of the colonies were working separately. The French and Indian War really brought them together. And it brought them together in the sense that they started to think, wow, we have a common enemy. And that common enemy is Britain. All right. Yeah, so increased tensions with Britain. Britain was like, yeah, no, you can't have that land, even though they fought for it, and we won it, and it's ours now. But the tensions became growingly even more severe after this. So it was the beginning of tensions with Britain. It also inflated their confidence. So you have colonists just like, hey, we can take care of ourselves and we really don't need you, Britain. So those types of feelings started to kind of bubble to the surface after the war of the French and Indian War. All right. So colonial unity. You can pause and read this, but essentially, during the French and Indian War, representatives gathered to talk about colonial unity. And it was led by people like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and all of these people. And they wanted to come up with a plan in order to reaffirm friendships in between the colonies and also with the Iroquois nation. And the Iroquois nation, if you remember, fought on the side of the British. So the problem, that they knew that there was a problem, that they were kind of broken and they need to actually work together. But even though they didn't adopt the Albany Plan, and what I just talked about was part of the Albany Plan, um, they still set a precedent, and a precedent for the future colonial unity that they would need to fight in the revolution. All right. I think I've already gone over this. But the British Empire gained more land in North America with the removal of the French, of course. And of course, the United States or the colonists might actually want to use that land. So, okay. So I've already talked about problem number two. Was the Western lands. The French might be gone, but there are Native Americans that still really want to call parts of these lands their home. I mean, shoot, they were there for thousands of years. And then here come people from France, people from England, thinking that they actually can fight over land. And it was very, very different for Native American tribes. And so that's when you have Pontiac's rebellion, and then England going, ooh, yeah, we don't want that kind of disruption. And so anyway, hence then the Proclamation of 1763. All right, so a little bit closer look at the Proclamation line of 1763. Here are the 13 original colonies. Here is Indian Reserve, or not reservations yet, but this land is reserved for Native Americans. And then you still have Spain hanging out over here. All right, so this Proclamation line, yeah, don't cross it. But then the colonists were like, yeah, we're crossing it. Okay, a problem number three was trade regulations and smuggling. So I believe we're going to talk a little bit more about this later in the week. But you have colonists in the 13 original colonies that are not happy with England. And they also don't want to pay a lot of the tariffs that have to be paid when you take in stuff or export things. And so you have a lot of people, a lot of colonists that are just starting to smuggle. They would rather, instead of pay the tariffs, they would rather just kind of sneak the goods in and out of the areas. And so what you have then is Britain, they're not making any money on any of these goods. And so that becomes a major problem that England eventually addresses. More to come on that. All right, problem number four, because of this war, were finances. And the finances of Britain's debt skyrocketed after the French and Indian War. So you have to kind of think about it in a couple of different ways. Number one, England was fighting a war all over the world. They were fighting in India. They were fighting on the colonial Americas. They were fighting in Europe. And so it was a very expensive war. And so you see from this chart that the debt essentially tripled, well, doubled, whatever. Okay, so you have in 1754, you have about, I don't know, 75 million pounds of debt. And then in 1763, you have about 142 or whatever. And so England has a real problem on their hands. They have a problem of a lot of debt. And so they have to problem solve. How are we going to pay this debt? Well, they looked to the colonies, of course. And so, again, more to come on that. The source of debt became a major source of resentment between the American colonists and their English leaders back in Britain. And the colonists were like, yeah, kind of a little joke about Bitcoin, but the colonists were like, yeah, no, this was your war. This was to benefit you. So you guys figure it out. And England was like, don't be selfish. You guys, we fought for you and you guys get to benefit. And so you need to pull your weight and help us out. And yeah, so it started going downhill between the colonists and England at this time. All right, so England's solutions to all of this stuff. A lot of it I've already kind of gone over, but England's solutions was to tax. So they brought forward the Stamp Act and other taxes in order to help them pay their debt. Proclamation of 1763, which we also have already gone over, it restricted the colonists from moving westward of the Appalachians, and hopefully that they were hoping that that would prevent further conflict between, and affect trade. It wouldn't affect trade, hopefully, between the Native Americans and the colonists. They also wanted to keep British troops in North America. So they kept British troops in many of the forts and to protect the colonists in the colonies from Indian attacks and also to protect, our goods and our people. They wanted to end salutary neglect. And you will be learning more about salutary neglect, but basically, that there were a whole bunch of rules established by England on the colonies, and those were called the Navigation Acts. Well, for a period of about 100 years, England just ignored their resolutions with the colonies and they ignored these navigation acts. Well, after the French and Indian War, England was like, hey, we have those navigation acts. And those navigation acts, if we enforce them, we actually could make quite a bit of money to pay off some of our debt. So why don't we start enforcing those again? And that was to help control the smuggling that the colonials were taking part in. And the colonials were like, yeah, no, we are going to just keep smuggling. And so, really, things were not going very well between the colonists in England. The enforcing of the Navigation Acts was kind of a joke at this point in time. So, there you have it. You have a whole bunch of issues that arose from the French and Indian War. And it really is the beginning of the colonists thinking about separating from England because number one, they can do it on their own. Number two, they're realizing just how gifted the United States, well, not the United States yet, but the colonies were with regards to natural resources, especially fur and soil and things like that. So they felt, hey, we might be able to separate from England. Plus, England is also trying to pull a fast one on us by charging us in order to pay for their war. So there you have it. A little bit about the French and Indian War, the Proclamation of 1763, and the beginning of the Revolution.